Hello again. In this video, we're going to be looking at Matthew 24. I believe understanding what Jesus predicted would happen is essential to understanding this issue of when will the rapture occur. I do believe Jesus refers to the rapture in this chapter, and so we will see that. I want to point it out to you in just a few minutes. So if you have your Bible, feel free to open it up. Again, Matthew chapter 24. There is a parallel in Mark chapter 13 and in Luke 21. We're not going to go through each of the parallel passages and what the different authors add or don't include and go over that. We're just going to stick in Matthew 24 for this particular lesson. In this context, Jesus had just told his disciples that the glorious temple that existed would one day be destroyed, and his disciples were concerned about what Jesus was talking about, and they asked him, when will these things take place, and what will be the sign of your return? And so Jesus answers in this chapter, and I want to point out that there are three major time divisions in Matthew chapter 24. So I'm going to go ahead and read the first few verses. Well, beginning in verse 3, actually. It says, while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him, this is Jesus, of course, privately and said, tell us, when will these things happen, and what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus replied to them, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, for there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these events are the beginning of labor pains. The beginning of labor pains. So when all of these events occur rapidly at the same time, that is the beginning of labor pains. So that is the first time division. Then Jesus says, then they will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, because lawlessness will multiply. The love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. This good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, what Jesus does next, if you look at verse 15, Jesus says, so when you see. Now, it's important to understand, it's not as obvious in our English translation, but the way the Greek construct here works, it ties it back to verse 9. So verse 9 through 14 is kind of an overall of what's going to happen from after the labor pains until the end. Okay? And then beginning in verses 15 through 28, Jesus goes into much more detail about that time frame that is covered in verses 9 through 14. So Jesus says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And he goes on to say, if you're on your house, don't go back. If you're pregnant, woe to you. If you're nursing, woe to you. Pray that this will not happen in the winter or on a Sabbath. But verse 21, look what he says. For at that time there will be great distress or tribulation or pressure. There will be a time of great tribulation. Then he says, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short because of the elect. And then he gives a warning not to listen to those false prophets who will come. Now, that's the second major time frame. So you have the birth pains, you have the great tribulation or distress or pressure. And then Jesus says in verse 29, and this is important to see his chronology, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So Jesus' elect are going to be there during the great tribulation, and he is going to cut short that tribulation that will come against his elect. And Jesus says that he is going to, or Matthew is recording what Jesus says, and he says that he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet to gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And so the next major time frame Jesus talks about is immediately after the Great Tribulation. So again, you have the birth pains, you have the Great Tribulation, and you have the period immediately after. Friends, the language that Jesus used where he talks about these cataclysms up in the sky, the sun goes dark and the moon turns to blood and the stars fall from the sky to the earth, this cosmic cataclysm that takes place, that is the language throughout the Old Testament that tells us the day of the Lord is near. And since the day of the Lord is God's wrath, we know that the rapture is about to happen. The rapture is going to be there to prevent this great tribulation that will be carried out by the world, spearheaded by the Antichrist, against Christ's church. The rapture is going to prevent the Antichrist from being able to eliminate the elect of Christ on this earth. And so it will be our deliverance from the day of the Lord. Going back to the idea of what is pre-wrath, it is the belief that Christ is going to rapture his church off the earth before he pours out his wrath on the earth. And we see, as Matthew 24 is laid out, we see exactly that. We have the beginning of birth pains, we have the great tribulation, and we have the rapture that will occur when the loud trumpet is sounded and his angels go out to gather up Christ's elect before he pours out his wrath. And again, his wrath is preceded by these cosmic cataclysm events. And so as I go through more and more topics, I'll get into more and more detail, especially about what is the day of the Lord, what is the Great Tribulation, what are these birth pains that we're seeing. We'll look at specific passages to go over this, and I understand this video is not going to be typical. This is definitely a little bit longer than what I want to do, but Matthew 24 is just such a seminal text in understanding the pre-wrath framework and understanding what Jesus taught about his return for his church.